Thank you again for joining us and joining in on the study of the 10 Commandments in 10 weeks. We're at lesson number 9, but because we did 2 commandments last week, we are now at commandment number 10, which I think is one of those ones that people have trouble understanding. Do not covet. What exactly does that mean? And we'll get into that. But before we do that, just like we do each week, let's do a very brief review of what we've looked at in the past weeks here. And we'll go through the different commandments. The first commandment, you shall have no other gods before me. God is preeminent. He is above all things. And so that's the top commandment, the most important commandment. And then dovetailing with that is that we are to have no graven images or idols. In other words, God does not want us to have any substitutes. There are to be no substitutes for Him. And we've talked about that in detail. You can look at that in some of the previous lessons. Third commandment, do not misuse God's name. It says you shall not misuse, that is, take in vain the name of the Lord your God, for the Lord will not hold anyone guiltless who misuses His name. And you might remember we talked about how this is not simply about using God's name in a flippant way, but it's about how we carry God's name in our daily life. As Christians, we carry the name of Christ. We are a Christian. I'm a Christian, and I carry the name of Christ. And so in everything I do, I need to carry the name of Christ with dignity. The fourth commandment was remember the Sabbath. This is the only commandment of these 10 commandments that is not specifically repeated for Christians to obey in the New Testament. Now, it doesn't mean that there is not a principle of a Sabbath, that we take breaks, we acknowledge God, and we trust in the Lord, and we take those times to do those things. So that's the fourth commandment. That's the only one that's not specifically repeated in the New Testament as a command for Christians. We worship on Sundays, the first day of the week, commemorating the resurrection of Christ generally, and the Old Testament to the Jews in that day, they were commanded to worship on the seventh day of the week, the Sabbath day. That brings us to the fifth commandment, honor your father and mother. And there's a lot that we talked about that in the past weeks there. The sixth commandment, you shall not murder. Human life is precious. God is the creator of human life. It should be treated with respect. And then also, the seventh commandment, you shall not commit adultery. God is the creator of marriage. The union of a man and a woman. Marriage is God's idea. We are to treat it with respect. When God prohibits something like adultery, He does it to provide for us because He wants the best for us, and He does it to protect us. And how many of you have seen the horrible effects of somebody that's gone outside of their marriage and the pain that it takes, that ensues from that? And because of that, in this commandment, we are to always be on guard. The eighth commandment is, you shall not steal. So this was last week. We did commandments 8 and 9. So the problem behind the problem of stealing is greed. There's usually the heart of the matter here is greed. There's something that you don't have that you want, so you take it. And then we went to the New Testament to look for the cure for stealing. Ephesians chapter 4:28, anyone who has been stealing must steal no longer, but must work doing something useful with their own hands, that they may have something to share with those in need. And so from that verse here, we see the threefold cure for stealing. First of all, honesty. In that verse you'll see where it says steal no longer. We see industry, work with your own hands. Replace that action with a useful action. And then finally, charity. You work with your own hands so you can earn your own living, so that you can, if you do gain money, you can share with those who are in need. And so then that brings us to the ninth commandment. We talked about that last week. You shall not give false testimony. There's a lot that we talked about that in depth, but here's the summary of this. God is always on the side of the truth. As the Apostle Paul wrote in Colossians 3, 9 through 10, do not lie to each other, since you have taken off the old self with its practices and have put on the new self, which is being renewed in knowledge in the image of its creator. So God is always going to be on the side of truth. And we also see that the enemy is always on the side of deception. And I always like this quote from Jesus in John 8:44. He's talking to some religious leaders who were trying to trip him up, and they were not being truthful. And he said, you belong to your father, the devil, and you want to carry out your father's desires. And this is the phrase here that I really find fascinating. He was a murderer from the beginning, not holding for the truth, for there is no truth in him. When he lies, he speaks his native language, for he is a liar and the father of lies. So somebody asks you, well, what's your native language? Well, lying. Well, that's what would be the enemy's. I think that's just quite a way that Jesus would phrase that. It's such a memorable way to put that. So let's move on now to tonight's commandment that we will focus on more in detail, and that is the 10th commandment, you shall not covet. And of course, we'll read here in Exodus 20 and verse 17, you shall not covet your neighbor's house, you shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his male or female servant, his ox or donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. In other words, you shall not covet. It's kind of interesting. It lists all those things out, but what does it mean to covet? Well, here's one definition. And again, as I've said before, so that I'm not guilty of you shall not steal, I lean on a lot of different resources. And anything you see here, there's nothing new under the sun. I'll just make that disclaimer here. And so to covet is to lust after or long for something with great desire. So if you're coveting, you're longing for something with some great desire. I would add to that with an unhealthy desire. An unhealthy desire, longing for something. There is a healthy way to want something, or to desire something. If you have a goal you're trying to reach, or maybe something you're saving up money for to buy something, you can do that in a healthy way. But coveting goes beyond a healthy way to a toxic way of doing this. So if you want to fill this out on your outline there, while the first 9 commandments address our outward actions. Outward actions. Don't commit adultery. That's an outward action. Don't steal. Outward action. Honor your father and mother. That involves outward actions. The 10th commandment addresses our inward thoughts. It's a sin that happens on the inside. It's a sin that happens on the inside. So where does coveting come from? Where does this, what is the root cause of coveting? We talked about stealing. The problem behind the problem of stealing was greed. The root cause of coveting is discontentment. And discontentment can be traced all the way back to the first humans, Adam and Eve. In the garden, the devil tried to convince Eve to believe a lie. And the lie is this: God is holding out on you. God is holding out on you. So you remember, God put Adam and Eve in the garden, gave them every tree and the fruit to eat of, except for one tree, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And so the serpent comes along and says to Eve, hey, why did God say you couldn't eat from any of these trees? Well, there's a first lie. It's a deception right there. And he said, well, no, he said, I can eat from any tree. I just can't eat from this one. And if I do, I'll die. We'll die. And the serpent said, no, you're not going to die. God just knows that you'll be like him if you eat from this tree. What's the lie? God is holding out on you. God is holding out on you. And so let's if you look in Genesis chapter 3, I'm going to read verses 4 through 6, and I've got the 6th verse highlighted on the screen there. The serpent said, "You will not certainly die. For God knows that when you eat from it, your eyes will be opened, and you'll be like God, knowing good and evil." God's holding out on you. Verse 6, when the woman saw that the fruit of the tree was good for food and pleasing to the eye, and also desirable for gaining wisdom, she took some of the bread and ate it. She also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate it. So everything was perfect in the garden, but the devil comes along, the serpent, and finds a way to sow discontentment into the heart of Adam and Eve. So notice that Adam and Eve's sin began from the inside out. Notice what happened there with Eve. She saw, that's happening on the inside. Well, I mean, she's seeing, but it's still, the vision is registering in her brain. All right, she saw, she desired. That's happening on the inside. Then it goes from the inside to the outside. She ate. She took. She ate. And she gave. So sin started on the inside and went on to the outside there. So this is what coveting is. It's this unhealthy desire for something, and it's believing that lie. God is holding out on you. So let's diagnose the problem here. It's not necessarily wrong to have a healthy desire for certain things in life. It's not wrong to admire what somebody else has. Every time I go to a concert or I meet somebody who is a fellow musician, like I like to play guitar and I'm a musician and to a certain extent, and I like to go up and talk to a musician and I'll admire their guitars. And, we'll talk about it and I'll think, man, that's great. And there might be a thought in my mind, boy, I'd love to have one of those one day. You think about that type of thing. But how do you know that just a healthy desire, how do you know when coveting is creeping in? When healthy desire is turning into coveting? Well, here are some tests. Okay, so here's test number one, if you want to write this down, is the resentment test. All right? Are you unhappy with your allotment in life? Do you have a feeling like you deserve something more? Do you find yourself saying things like this? Why does so-and-so have that and I'm stuck with this? Maybe you're looking at somebody else's car. How come they have that fine whatever and I've got this rust bucket over here? And so there's if you can see, is there any resentment I'm having? So I might be saying, well, how come I can't have a guitar like, you can just think about this. That's where coveting, resentment comes in. So found this illustration, maybe you've heard this story about Abe Lincoln. The story is told that Abe Lincoln was walking down the street with his two young sons, both of whom were acting up and they were, misbehaving, fighting with each other. A passerby asked, "What's wrong with your boys?" Lincoln replied with his usual wit, "Exactly what's wrong with the whole world. I have 3 walnuts and each boy wants 2. Coveting, that resentment. How come you get 2 and I get 1? That kind of thing. It's kind of like if we raised an only child and I was an only child, so I didn't have all of this going on, but I've heard the stories of siblings. If you're going to divide a piece of cake in 2, you better make that thing exactly right because one's going to be eyeballing the other side of the cake. So that's test number 1 is resentment. Test number 2 would be the test of time. Think of this. What do you spend your time thinking about? So here's the idea. Thoughts and deeds, thoughts and desires have a way of working into our deeds. The things we think about, the things we desire, have a way of working into our actions. This brings up a familiar passage from James chapter 1, beginning in verse 13. When tempted, no one should say, God is tempting me. For God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone. But each person is tempted when they are dragged away by their own evil desire and enticed, coveting. Then after desire, coveting, has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is full grown, gives birth to death. So, what are you spending your time dwelling on? So, test number 1 is resentment, test number 2 is time, and test number 3 is rejoicing. Romans 12:15 urges us to rejoice with those who rejoice and mourn with those who mourn. Let me ask you this. Are you happy when someone else gets good news? Or have you ever been secretly jealous? Can you celebrate someone else's success? Or do you ever feel bitter or cheated? If you feel that way, it could be that the old devil is trying to whisper that lie into your ear. God is holding out on you. And so if you honestly answer these questions of resentment, time, and rejoicing, you can see if you're possibly vulnerable to developing a coveting heart. So this is the sin of the heart. So there's some tests there you can administer there and see if you're resentful, what you're focusing on, or if you're able to rejoice when somebody has a success. So let's move on here in our outline here, and we'll look more in detail at this 10th commandment here. And so the past several commandments we've done have been like this one sentence commands. You shall not murder, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not bear false testimony. But this one, it reads like a bullet point list. It says, it doesn't just say you shall not covet. It says this, you shall not covet your neighbor's house. All right, so it gets pretty specific here. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. How come they get such a nice house and I'm stuck here in this place? That type of thing. So there's a cartoon. I tried to find it. I couldn't find it, but there's a cartoon that shows 2 fields divided by a fence. Each field is the same size, and each has plenty of green, lush grass in each of the fields. They look exactly alike. In each field, there's a mule, and each mule has its head sticking through the fence, eating grass from the other mule's pasture. That might be a picture of coveting there. Each mule thought that the other mule's grass was greener, fresher, and better. Isn't that interesting? I think there's always isn't it interesting how that there might be a restaurant that you really like, and like that's in Columbus. And if you go to Columbus, we got to go there. But then once they build one in Newark, it just doesn't seem so great anymore, does it? Man, it's all because, when you got to drive 30 minutes, you're going to like that, But then, I remember we used to love, there used to be a Boston Market here in Heath, and it was only in Columbus, and we'd love going to Boston Market. Man, it was the best place. And then once it came here, okay, whatever, because it was in our own pasture, I guess. Maybe that's just human nature. But do not covet your neighbor's house. Do not covet your neighbor's wife. Now, isn't it interesting how a lot of these commandments overlap with each other when it comes to adultery? Do not covet your neighbor's wife. And again, this is another way of saying do not lust. Jesus said in Matthew 5:28 in the Sermon on the Mount, but I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. I guess another way you could say this is that anyone who covets his neighbor's wife has already committed adultery. So this commandment overlaps with others. What's the next bullet point here? So this will take a little explanation. Do not covet your neighbor's male or female servant. Now, we when we talked about do not steal, and also there's some other studies we've gone of how God in the Bible is very clearly prohibits the slave trade as we would have known it in Western culture, in our history, and in English history, and all of that. It's very, and we looked at those different passages that talked about that. So we have the male or female servant here. So having a servant in that day implied that the household was doing well financially. All right. So this is talking about envying a standard of living. So, if you're, for instance, let's just say you're content with the home that you have. You're thankful for it and you're enjoying it, and then suddenly you go visit a friend who has a whole lot more, and suddenly you're maybe tempted to be a little less content with what you have. I wish I had my own staff for my house. We don't have a staff for our house, but things like that. I wish, maybe you have a one-car garage, but your neighbor has a two-car garage. Well, I wish I had a two-car garage. So some passages that go along with this, Proverbs 15:16, better a little with the fear of the Lord than great wealth with turmoil. A modern way of putting this in the vernacular would be this: mo money, mo problems. All right. Luke 12:15, this is the English Standard Version. And Jesus said to them, take care and be on your guard against all covetousness, for one's life does not consist of the abundance of his possessions. Again, this is just coveting a person's status in life. And then I really like the Apostle Paul's words in Philippians 4, verses 11 through 13. He said, I have learned to be content whatever the circumstances. I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty. I have learned the secret to being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, living in plenty or in want. I can do all this through Him who gives me strength. And so I can do all these things through Christ who gives me strength is not about, being able to be to lift to something or do, whatever it might be, or reach some goal. It's about I can be content at any time because Christ gives me strength. That's the secret power of my life. And so this brings us to the next one here. You shall not covet your neighbor's ox or donkey. Now, raise your hand if you have been jealous of your neighbor's ox or donkey. Okay, I can tell some of you have just got to come to terms with what's been in your heart, and you'll let it out eventually. Of course, none of us, unless maybe we live in Wyoming, we have neighbors that have ox and donkey, or maybe live on a farm or something. What is this about? This represents harboring a dissatisfaction with one's livelihood, comparing it to someone else. Here's the attitude. Anyone who is more successful than me must be less virtuous than I am. That's the thinking there. Anyone who is more successful than me in their job must be less virtuous than I am. And so you're looking at that person who's, so if in that day, if you had an ox or a donkey, they would multiply the work you could do in agriculture. And if you had multiple animals, then that would multiply that work. And so this was the idea of coveting another person's, harboring resentment over the income or the business that another person was able to do. And then in case the Lord was thinking that we would just use this and use this as a way to find some loopholes around coveting, He said, and anything that belongs to your neighbor. He just lines it out there. Anything. Coveting can point up or down. I've put it this way. So in other words, someone with less can covet one who has more. One of the terms we hear a lot, and this is not to get political at all, is you hear people complaining, well, the 1% do this and the 1% do that, talking about those who have the most, or maybe have been most successful. And certainly in the 1%, there's probably some greedy people. But in the heart of a lot of those comments, what I hear is a covetous heart. They shouldn't have what they have. They should just give it all to me. This idea. So coveting can point up. I wish I had what that person had. But coveting also can point down. The one who has more can covet the one who has less. Now, what do I mean by this? I want to just share with you, this is a long passage here. It's 16 verses. But here is an account from the Old Testament. It's in 1 Kings 21. And this is an example of somebody who had more coveting somebody who had less. All right, sometime later, there was an incident involving a vineyard belonging to Naboth the Jezreelite. The vineyard was in Jezreel, close to the palace of Ahab, king of Samaria. Now, Samaria would have been the northern kingdom at the northern part of Palestine or of Canaan, where Israel was. Ahab said to Naboth, "Let me have your vineyard to use for a vegetable garden, since it is close to my palace. In exchange, I will give you a better vineyard, or if you prefer, I will pay you whatever it's worth." But Naboth replied, "The Lord forbid that I should give you the inheritance of my ancestors." So Ahab went home sullen and angry because Naboth the Jezreelite had said, "I will not give you the inheritance of my ancestors." I like this. He lay on his bed sulking and refused to eat. Do you think something's going on inside of him? It's a covetous spirit. While his wife, Jezebel, have you ever noticed that we never name our children Ahab or Jezebel anymore? Because you knew that. But anyway, his wife, Jezebel, came in and asked him, "Why are you so sullen? Why won't you eat?" He answered her, "Because I said to Naboth the Jezreelite, 'Sell me your vineyard, or if you prefer, I will give you another vineyard in its place.' But he said, 'I will not give you my vineyard.'" I can kind of hear him whining through this whole thing. Jezebel, his wife, said, "Is this how you act as king over Israel? Get up and eat. Get up and eat. Cheer up, and I'll get you the vineyard of Naboth the Jezreelite." So she wrote letters in Ahab's name, placed his seal on them, and sent them to the elders and nobles who lived in Naboth's city with him. In those letters she wrote, "Proclaim a day of fasting, and seat Naboth in a prominent place among the people, but seat 2 scoundrels opposite him, and have them bring charges that he has cursed both God and the king. Then take him out and stone him to death." So the elders and nobles who lived in Naboth's city did as Jezreel directed in the letters she had written to them. They proclaimed a fast and seated Naboth in a prominent place amongst the people. Then 2 scoundrels came and sat opposite him and brought charges against Naboth. Now that's false testimony, in case you were wondering from last week's lesson there. Before the people, saying, "Naboth has cursed both God and the king." So they took him outside the king and stoned him to death. Then they sent word to Jezebel, "Naboth has been stoned to death." As soon as Jezebel heard that Naboth had been stoned to death, she said to Ahab, "Get up and take possession of the vineyard of Naboth the Jezreelite, that he refused to sell you. He is no longer alive, but dead." When Ahab heard that Naboth was dead, he got up, went down to take possession of Naboth's vineyard. Now isn't that a heartwarming story to hear that? It's messed up, isn't it? It's very messed up. But what's the heart of it? Coveting. I want what you have, and I want you not to have it. I'm jealous of what you have. And I don't think Ahab had missed any meals. I don't think he had any problem with, he was king of Israel, the northern kingdom there. And so as we finish up here, let's just look here at the cures for covering. We're going to finish out a little bit early tonight, but that's okay. The cures for coveting is this. First of all, develop an attitude of contentment. Now, this brings to mind something my father used to say that I have quoted many times. I've probably quoted it here in these studies. Is my father would say, "Son, there are two ways to be wealthy. You can go out and get a lot of money, or you can make your needs simple. If your needs are simple, then you'll be wealthy. Develop an attitude of contentment." So 1 Timothy 6, verse 6, but godliness, I got to read that right, but godliness with contentment is great gain. For we brought nothing into the world, and we can take nothing out of it. But if we have food and clothing, we will be content with that. Those who want to get rich fall into temptation and a trap, and into many foolish and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction, just like that account of Ahab. For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. Some people eager for money have wandered from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs. And where does the love of money come from? Where does this come from? It comes from the idea of coveting. That's what's inside. This is a sin that begins on the inside. So develop that attitude of contentment, which I would reason would be the opposite of coveting. And then along with that, it's fitting that last week was Thanksgiving, develop an attitude of gratitude. 1 Thessalonians 6, 16 through 18. Rejoice always. Pray continually. Give thanks in all circumstances, for this is God's will for you in Christ Jesus. Now you might remember just a few weeks ago, I think it was on a Sunday morning, David Lynn spoke on this very passage right here. Some people say, well, we're supposed to give thanks for all circumstances. It doesn't say give thanks for all circumstances. It says give thanks in all circumstances. And that brings me back to my mother's favorite verse, Romans 8:28. For all things work together for the good of those who follow Him, who follow the Lord. And it doesn't say that all things are good. All things work together for the good. And so there is an overview of the sin of coveting. So I hope that this week you will go out and not covet. So we'll conclude our study next week by a quick review of what we've looked at, but also tying it in together of how the Old Testament law and the New Testament all fit together, and how we are to live this out as Christians and as followers of Christ.